Okay. Welcome everybody to our lunch and learn. I ate my lunch beforehand because I didn't want you to watch me chew, but if you're eating, eat your lunch because we're all busy people, including Chase. Thank you so much for being here. I'm not going to do too much of an introduction because she so brilliantly has integrated it into her presentation. But I do have to say, I've known Chase long enough that I first kind of got to know her when we did a panel of kids that had been in foster care. And she was on my panel. And gosh, I don't even know how many years ago, but I feel like you were a kid then. And now you're like this master's level graduate presenter extraordinaire. So I am just really, really proud of you. And we're honored to be able to have you here with us today. Chase, the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me, Kathy. I really appreciate it. I just want to thank everybody for being here today as well. This conversation that hopefully we will be engaging in is going to be about ambiguous loss and moral injury, which can be a very hard and challenging topic. So I encourage everybody to just lean into the uncomfortability and ask questions, be curious, and try to get as much out of it as you are willing to do today. Usually before I start my presentation, I ask everybody to get a piece of paper or, start a Word document, and I ask everybody to put your name in the middle of it. So I have just a scratch piece of paper right here myself, and I put my name in the middle, and I want you guys to spend maybe about 2 to 3 minutes writing everything you love about your job, about your profession, things that you still enjoy. It's okay if it's lunchtime. That's perfectly fine. Thank you for letting me imbibe upon yours today. But write the things that you love about your job, the things that make you excited. And then you guys are going to go ahead and keep this either physical or maybe virtual document. And we're going to use that later on today, okay? So while you guys are doing that, I want to just go ahead and get some of my introduction out of the way. Um, Today, obviously, we are going to be having some very interesting and challenging conversations. The unspoken sorrow of children, parents, and professionals prompted by child welfare intervention is often suffered in silence. The concept of grief and loss is typically applied to death in our modern day society. However, death is not always the precipitating event to some of these intense, dark emotional states. Families and professionals are often confronted with challenging ethical and moral situations daily when addressing child abuse and neglect due to the ambiguity, stigma, guilt, and shame attached to this intervention. Because of that, through our work, we may observe, participate, and even hear of issues that violate our core beliefs on what is right. So today we're going to explore the space of loss and injury that may lead individuals to experience an inconsistency between who we want to be and who we are. So to introduce myself, my name is Chase Hagan. I am a family engagement facilitator with Mesa County Department of Human Services. I have been involved in the child welfare system as a professional for over 6.5 years, and I am also a lived experience expert. Actually was a foster child here in Mesa County many, many years ago. And so I have a very unique experience and lens that allows me to see our system and participate in it in a different way. And I try to utilize my experiences to help bring awareness to our system, as well as try to implement innovative solutions through that lens of lived experience. Again, these are very challenging conversations, so I feel like I've done it, but a formal trigger warning of we will be having some really challenging conversations. So if you do need to step away or take a break, please feel free to do so. But I really hope you guys can stay with us through the duration of today's event. The last title that I have is that I am an adjunct professor. I teach general psychology over at Colorado Mesa University and have a wonderful time doing so. With that, I'm leaning into my teachering a little bit and wanted to give you guys some learning objectives. So today, the main goals of this Luncheon We'll Learn will be to understand the definition, prevalence, and symptoms of moral injury, how it relates to other psychological conditions, as well as understanding the implementation of truth telling and witnessing to be able to develop collective compassion around the ambiguous loss and moral injury associated with child welfare to also help and enhance child well-being through this process, whether that's through policy advocacy, your day-to-day interactions, whatever that may be. So just out of curiosity, I want to lean into the chat just because this is a new and emerging field. What is your familiarity with moral injury? So on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being I'm an expert, you could teach this with me, 5 being I don't know much of anything. If you guys could just enter into the chat where you think you land, that would be really helpful for me. Ooh, Megan, be careful. That means I might have to have you join me next time. Okay, so kind of a good spread. Fantastic. So for those of you who feel like you're on the higher end, I highly encourage you guys ask questions, bring in your experiences, and you know, invite conversation, if you will. For those of you who may feel a little bit on the lower end, again, same concepts. Ask questions. Please be curious. I want this to be a fun, interactive opportunity. We will have a discussion at the end. So if you would prefer to wait till then, we can do that as well. So moving forward, we need to talk about what ambiguous loss is. Of course, the definition that is typically, typically shown is a type of grief that it refers to a loss that remains unverified and without resolution. There are a variety of different events that occur within a child welfare case that can prompt grief and loss, including removal, placement changes, disruptions, termination, etc. And so I have provided you some examples of what that can look like here. Ambiguous loss has 2 specific dimensions. It has to deal with the absence of an individual, specifically whether it's in the physical dimension or the psychological dimension. And the 2 ways they differentiate it is physical absence, but psychologically present. So that could look like relocation, incarceration, all of those examples presented there. And then I just want to make sure you guys can see that. Okay, hold on. We went too far. We're going backwards. There we go. Now you guys can see. My apologies. And then we have psychologically absent, but physically present. So that would look more so related to addiction, brain injury, some sort of cognitive or developmental disability. So when these ambiguous losses occur, identity crises may also occur as a result of this loss, resulting in perceived changes or losses of specific identities specific to parenthood, parenthood, social economic status, gender, etc. So ambiguous loss overall can erode trust, prompt isolation, and ultimately impact one's ability to develop healthy, positive relationships over time. Since I have done some wonderful foreshadowing, that leads us into disenfranchised grief. So disenfranchised grief, as defined, is a personal loss that is not openly acknowledged, socially mourned, or publicly accepted or supported. This is typically a loss where the society itself has failed the griever by simply not recognizing their right to grieve. According to Bryan and Peck, disenfranchised grief can actually be defined by 5 broad categories. Those include the status of the relationship, the level of acknowledgement, griever's status, circumstances, as well as grief patterns. And this is how it can be presented. And some very specific examples that you may see within our work for child welfare or even adult services would be seen here below. So stigma greatly influences the grief experiences where individuals can feel deprived of their right to grieve or unseen in their grief. Internalization or self-disenfranchisement, so where individuals believe that the right to grieve is not appropriate, they can actually exacerbate the normal grieving or bereavement process and result in feelings of anger, guilt, powerlessness, ambivalence, and potentially even reducing sources of support as a result of isolation. So, therefore, it impacts their ability to psychologically adjust and adapt to loss. And this inability to cope is what can lead to moral injury. Another dynamic of this, as many of you are working within that field of child welfare, us as professionals can fall into this feeling as well, right? You create beautiful attachments and relationships, whether it be with clients or families or whomever you are serving. And many of us rarely get to see them through to the end, right? We don't always know how the story ends. And that could be a space in which you yourself may experience some disenfranchised grief, or perhaps the clients that you're serving. If you are serving foster parents who have a loss of a child that returns home, even through the happiest of circumstances and reunification, or perhaps is transitioned to a kinship home or something to that nature. Or even perhaps the loss or transition of an adult client as well to a different agency. So different ways in which this might show up for you guys. Before we can really discuss about moral injury, it seems pertinent that we need to discuss moral codes. There are a variety of definitions that you guys can see on the screen, but what I would encourage you to do is adopt the last definition for the purposes of this training. So as you can see here, that would be a set of rules or standards that people choose to live by in order to keep their behavior aligned with the values of their culture, of their upbringing. Can you guys think of any maybe specific examples that you guys have seen either independently or in your culture? And you can either raise your hand, speak up in the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with.
Um, my best friend and I were talking about how today in our culture, um, the eldest child is meant to take care of the elder, but as time has progressed, we've seen our aunts and uncles, have this tradition, I guess, but we're branching out. And so it's creating a lot of waves well, mostly in his family right now, yeah.
Absolutely. That's definitely a new cultural shift, a new moral code that may exist as a result of our population and how that shows up. Do anybody else have any other examples they'd like to share? Some common ones I can think of within our professions or existing ones would be the doctor's oath, right? Do no harm. That's a moral code that currently exists. Social workers have their own codes of ethics, as do psychologists, right? So we have ethical and moral codes built into our societies, built into our cultures, some of which are plainly spoken, some of which are just internally known. Although it's not necessarily a moral code, right? An office code. We don't burn popcorn. We don't put fish in the microwave, right? A little bit of a lackadaisical example, but still prominent nevertheless, right? So spoken and unspoken, there are moral codes that everybody has that we choose to live by, and that guides ultimately our behavior and how we interact with others. So that leads us into moral injury. This is defined generally by research as psychological damage or distress as a result of the action or inaction of self or others that conflict with one's moral code. It can have lasting psychological, biological, and spiritual impacts to one's functioning. This term was actually introduced initially by psychiatrist Jonathan Shea in 2014. In some of his work, he actually described moral injury as the undoing of character. His original work was focused on moral anguish as a result of observing Vietnam veterans as they returned home from war and the impact that it had on them. This phenomenon is most commonly studied as a result in medical professionals and military populations, while the human services population has been overlooked for the last few decades. Moral injury can occur within the field of social work or human services as a result of several different phenomena. And they tend to break it up very specifically as perpetrating harmful acts, witnessing them, failing to prevent them, and learning about them. So ultimately covered in that definition that I provided you. So before we move on, I want to make sure, did everybody have time to create their either physical or virtual paper with your name and everything you loved about your job? I'm seeing some thumbs up, some nods. Okay, perfect. So with that, what's going to happen next is I want you guys, if you do have your physical paper, I want you, anytime you have experienced any of the following symptoms as a result of the definition that was just provided, I want you to tear, crumple, maim, color on your paper. If you had to create a digital paper or a mental one, do with it what you may, color over it, put stickers, emojis, whatever you think is best for you. Anytime that you've experienced the following, there will be a series of symptoms listed. And every time you've experienced it, even if it was just once, do something to your proverbial paper in whatever form it exists, okay? So you have guilt, shame, anger, anxiety, depression, a loss of meaning or faith, lost trust in your worldview, or damage to your moral code. So out of curiosity, most times when we do this in person, it's very loud in the room. It's not ever very, very quiet whatsoever. But I appreciate everybody being on mute. Is anybody willing to maybe pull up their paper and show what it looks like? Just flash it to the screen. Ah, yes, I see some sticky notes, some folding. Okay. Very nice, very nice. Is anybody's paper exactly how it was when you started? No, probably not. Of course, I wouldn't expect anybody's paper to be exactly how it started. But I think this is a very clear physical representation of the impact of the work that we do and whatever role you guys may be in. And moral injury is pervasive. It's very hard to avoid and it can happen very quickly. So being aware of the impacts of moral injury, because as I said, all of those things, I'm sure something popped into your brain, a specific example, a person, a story, right? Something that showed up for you. And it's very important to recognize, now that you have this definition, what may just be all of the fun trigger words we already know, right? Secondary trauma, vicarious trauma. Moral injury is a little bit different. It's a bit bigger because it's tied to our morality, what we perceive to be right and wrong. And that is very impactful to our functioning. So I encourage you guys to keep your papers, frame them, post them, but keep them around as a reminder, because all of those things are still true. Everything you still love about your job is still relevant. It is still important. It just is going to be seen through a different lens if and when moral injury is present. So moving forward, let's talk about how these themes of moral injury tend to show up. Moral injury is prevalent in social work, and it needs to change, not only for the benefit of professionals and agencies, but the children, families, and greater communities that they serve. Here are some of the specific examples in which moral injury has shown up in a community level, whether or not just in greater social work terms, such as, again, the maltreatment of vulnerable populations, children, DD individuals, adults, etc., the dissolution of families and or relationships, involuntary system involvement, failure to obtain justice on behalf of victims, as well as general distrust of systems perpetrated by public narratives. However, within the sphere of child welfare specifically, current research suggests that there are 7 categories or themes of moral injury that occur within child welfare, both for professionals and parents, which can be seen on the right of the screen. And so those look a little bit different than the more broad terms for social work as it relates specifically to the behavior of professionals, problematic services, so whether or not they are targeted services intending to do what they were designed for, access, etc. The dynamics of an adversarial system, systemic bias that is present, parents' actions or lack thereof at times, if there is perceived harm to children from either side, as well as problematic laws, policies, or procedures. Additional research was actually conducted in Sweden, which identified 2 additional themes that are specifically parent related, which include seeing a child withdraw in a case. So whether or not withdrawing from their relationship, perceived withdrawal as a result of bonding to a new caregiver, or just lack of participation, as well as the feeling of being excluded. So not necessarily being able to fully participate or feel that their input is valued is a huge dynamic in which moral injury and loss can occur in this field of child welfare. Researchers actually even conducted standardized testing utilizing the moral injury event scale, or the MICE scale, and found that the responses for child welfare professionals, the mean score on the MICE, were actually within the same ranges for those who are serving actively in the Air Force and National Guard, as well as right on par with parents. So there is a clear statistical correlation of moral injury occurring not only for our parents, but also for us as professionals. So what does this look like? We talk a lot about parallel process. So what we do with our workers, we want to extend to our families and vice versa, up and down. And it's very clear that moral injury impacts all of us. So distress specifically can happen when a professional knows the ethically appropriate action, but cannot take that action due to internal or personal constraints, as well as external or institutional constraints. This can lead to painful feelings and psychological difficulties, and other factors such as low psychological safety, and jobs and increased job stress or time pressure were positively correlated with those experiences of moral distress. As you can see here, this research study that was conducted with over 1,800 child welfare workers found that morally distressing conditions were mostly encountered as a result of their work, with over 60% reporting they've experienced it. 40% indicating that their job required them to do something that was against their better judgment or that they did not agree with, as well as the implication that rules and regulations interfere with their ability to do their jobs effectively or in a way that they feel is in accordance with their values. This emphasizes the need for acknowledging and understanding workers' moral distress experiences, which is vital to worker well-being. And workers need to be able to feel safe speaking up about moral distress so they feel empowered to advocate for their own needs as well as their families. So organizations can support workers by focusing on fostering positive psychological safety within the workplace. And this can be done in various ways, but research really recommends doing so in a way that destigmatizes perceptions of failure, reducing or eliminating cultures of blame, and training supervisors or leaders on how to develop a psychologically safe climate. And this could also be implemented by utilizing concepts and impacts of moral distress into caseworker or foster parent training for professional development to help them create awareness around this psychological phenomenon so they can be aware of those symptoms to prevent and enhance their resiliency against these dynamics. Are there any questions so far or any comments? All right. So moving forward, how is it different, right? Like I said, there's a lot of trigger words that we have: secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, burnout. We're all fairly familiar with these concepts, but moral distress is unique in the way that, again, individuals know the ethically appropriate action, but they can't take it. And so, excuse me one second. I really like this icon here that really looks at the dynamics that exist for moral injury, and that it is actually a continuum. It's not just one event that results in moral injury occurring, but it actually is a span of time in which a potentially morally injurious event can occur, and the frustration that is leading, if there is not a level of resolution as a result of ambiguous loss or disenfranchised grief, can result in long-term distress, short-term frustration. And if that distress and frustration cannot reasonably be coped with, that is when moral injury specifically occurs. So, looking at it from the secondary lens of how is it different, here is, for those of you who like math, I imagine not many of you because you went into social work and not accounting, but for those of you who prefer a clear picture, here is the mathematical equation. Burnout plus secondary or vicarious trauma equals compassion fatigue, and moral distress is all of those things combined. And the reason why is because they each look at one of those elements of moral injury, whether it's those internal constraints, external constraints, or the internal resulting feelings. So burnout specifically is defined as feelings of hopelessness and detachment resulting in that lack of motivation or interest. These are typically environmentally driven. So this would be job stress, caseload, policy, etc. External things outside of the individual that are creating these feelings. Then you have the secondary trauma, which again, also true, still external, but this is exposure as a result of interactions with others, right? If we did not work with people, we would not necessarily have the secondary trauma if we were just in our wonderful little bubbles all day. And it is ultimately just a result of interacting with the people that we do every day, and the level of crisis and trauma and pain that we see, but also at the same time, the level of joy and interaction and community that we get to build as a result. So we can't have one without the other, unfortunately, but that is the dynamics that contribute to that secondary and vicarious trauma. Therefore, the last dynamic there is that compassion fatigue. So that emotional state of stress and exhaustion impacting biological, psychological, and social functioning, resulting in your decreased ability to cope because of the lack of compassion, right? You guys are fatigued. It's hard to respond the same way you would in your career 5 years in compared to your first day, right? I think a lot of us, especially as we see newer workers entering this field, we see them usually very excited, very joyful, very driven. And we all sit there and we're like, yep, I can't wait to see you a day from now, a week from now, a year from now. So normalizing and validating ambiguous loss and moral injury as a result of intervention is only the beginning of being able to combat disenfranchised grief. And it will be interesting to see how you guys fall in this next area here. So this is the responder stress continuum. This was actually developed based off of the Combat and Operational Stress First Aid Kit by Laura McGladlery. And I don't know if you guys have seen this before, but it's becoming fairly popular. And it's one way to evaluate your level of stress and where you're operating from. So, out of curiosity, and if you are willing, I would encourage you guys in the chat, just kind of report where you're operating from today. Are you in the green? Are you in the yellow, the orange, the red? And if you're not comfortable, that's perfectly fine. But I'm curious where we are sitting at today. Okay, so some orange, maybe some red. I don't know these emojis. I'm not great at always differentiating colors. Yeah. And it's perfectly fine to feel like you maybe are in between some stages. And I'm really happy to hear. It sounds like there's a lot of positivity here. Some people who have been in the green or currently in the green. For those of you who just coming back to work, I'm quite jealous. So for those of you who are in the green, have you guys ever been in the orange or the yellow or the red? Ooh, I like some of these comments here. Switching positions. Switching positions within an organization or just tasks even can be very beneficial to helping manage stress. So I'm happy somebody brought that dynamic up. This is actually a really great tool to utilize within your practice, whether or not working with clients, working in a supervisory role, being able to utilize this specific continuum to help people do some introspection and some reflection about where they're operating at, and utilizing that as a way to also help guide care and evaluate potential services, right? If you're meeting with somebody who's constantly in the orange and the red, which is where moral injury typically occurs the most, talking with them about like what would it look like or what would need to happen to be able to move to the yellow or just one step down. Or is that even possible, right? So this is a tool I really hope you guys can implement and utilize to assist in not only maybe helping yourself, but maybe in your practice as well to help others with identifying where they're at and utilizing it to help guide care. So moving forward, truth telling. Most of the time, right, we go to these trainings and we talk about some of these really hard, heavy things, and we walk out and we're like, okay, we talked about them, but what are we going to do about it? There was no solutions. There was nothing that we could do differently. So that's what I'm trying to impart with you guys today. Typically, this training does allow for the opportunity to engage in truth telling. But because of the virtual option and dynamics, we're going to suspend that for today, especially since this is being recorded. However, we are going to introduce what it looks like and potentially how you guys think it could be implemented within your practices. So, truth telling, or also known as team talk, can specifically enhance resiliency and professional identity development, as well as facilitating the process of learning and knowledge transfer within organizations. Professional truth-telling in containment can actually help support the parallel process of truth-telling for children, families, and clients about their experiences of moral injury as a result of their interactions with the child welfare system or whatever system you may be currently operating in. So on a larger scale, truth-telling can create a feedback loop between families, professionals, organizations, and governing bodies to help inform policy practice improvement. Truth-telling is a specific practice in which it is an open forum, and you do not necessarily provide intervention. You do not provide inquiry. You are merely there to help witness another person's experience. And specifically, in this case, it would have been around moral injury. So, again, as we will not necessarily be doing this in this context, I'm not going to focus on the group agreements, but this exercise that I would have presented today would have focused on a priming statement asking you guys about an experience that you may have had recently or in the past that had occurred where moral injury was present. So, a specific time and space in which you may have felt short living up to your moral values, or did something, acted or observed another person acting in a way that you felt was not accurate or right, and failed to make a moral difference as a result of your moral code. And so, knowing that you now have the definition, you're aware of the prevalence, how it shows up, and the symptoms of it, this would be a great exercise to be able to implement, and asking people to specifically break it down for you. Like, what happened? How did you feel? What actions, like, why is there moral injury present? And why individuals did that. So, because we will not necessarily be engaging in it, I know a lot of us are typically helpers and we tend to ask questions or try to offer solutions, but trying this new lens of just truth telling and allowing to be a witness to somebody else's experience can be very empowering and impactful. And so I want to kind of start this conversation of, now that you guys have this knowledge around moral injury, what it looks like, how it shows up, how do you feel like you can implement this knowledge into your practice and perhaps even implement truth telling as well?
I think the truth telling, it just kind of gives that sense of there are other people that have gone through something, and there's that camaraderie and like support, and just kind of hearing that those aren't things that you've experienced alone, and that other people have also experienced them, and maybe kind of how they handled it. Even if it's, bad, like knowing that, like, hey, this person has also experienced this, has also gone through the same thing, and apparently, has moved past it and made a resolution to it.
Thank you for speaking up, Jennifer. I absolutely agree. When I've done this in the past, that's definitely been some feedback I've gotten of how empowering it was to hear the perspective of another individual who may or may not have had a similar or very different experience, and how that created that opportunity for introspection and personal growth, and an opportunity to create genuine connection as well. Any other thoughts or maybe criticisms?
I love that it gives us some words and some language around how to talk about some of this stuff, because there's I don't know, I don't want to say it's taboo, but I've been in the field long enough where it's like, um, I think we could just kind of shrug and say, oh, it's the system, or, oh, there's nothing we can do about this, that, or the other thing. But there really is that deep sense of loss sometimes when you are watching what's going on in some of our cases that are just really hard. And I mean, again, I've been in the field for so long, I just have known so many people that it has really driven people out of the field, which is huge too. And I'm so grateful that I've been able to weather it, and grateful that we've learned so much in the field over time about secondary trauma, and what it is to, practice wellness, and all that. But this is just for me an added dimension to what we're doing. So I'm really thankful for your talk today and for bringing that to
Thank you.
light. Yeah.
Absolutely. I really appreciate that. And I think, especially sharing what you've shared, we have this tendency, right, to harden, to maybe harden up as a way to protect ourselves, whether it's us as professionals or observing maybe some of our clients that we work with because of the moral injury or the loss or all of this things that, I mean, we experience. It is an unfortunate symptom of the way the system is currently operating. And that ability to name it, having the words to be able to call it out for somebody else, and to implement truth telling and saying of like, share your experience. Like, it is hard, and allowing that cathartic release can hopefully prevent the hardening and loss as a way of improving retention for our clients, for ourselves, right? Not talking about it hasn't worked. We wouldn't be here if we didn't talk about it. So we need to start using our voices and empowering others to do the same so we can prevent this continuous cycle. So Becky, I really appreciate that feedback that you had. Any other thoughts, curiosities?
I kind of want to go off of what she said. I think the more that we talk about like things that are hard or traditionally that we don't, everybody just goes, well, it comes with it. And you don't talk about it, you're less likely to change some of the things that surround it. So like talking about, which is not a professional thing, but dealing with like the loss of kiddos and their family and what they're going through, instead of just being like, well, they're in a better place now, like acknowledging that some of these things that others go through too allows us to like break that kind of taboo part of it and start saying like, hey, we need to talk about like the loss of even, kiddos that have a reason to be removed and things. And then talking about like, hey, this is like, it's normal for them to feel bad and not to be like, oh, thank gosh, I'm in a really great home with a new bedspread. Like talking about these things as they are allows us to have those conversations with others too when they come up, and just generally break that taboo around it. Just like I want to go with like, say, sexual assault, like, right? Sexual assault, we used to be very, very like hush hush about it. We don't talk about it. We keep it under secret. And then, I think society has changed and we're much more like, no, like we don't have to keep quiet with these things. And it's led to a lot of changes on like the big level, like, hey, we can talk about sexual assault too. We don't have to play nice with family members. You don't have to give touch and things to people when you don't want to. So it's not just that one thing. It turns into all the things that touch it that we can make better.
Absolutely. You definitely are speaking to that parallel process, even on a larger scale, and the importance and the influence too of society, right? Like it has to start somewhere. And I'm so thankful that I was able to bring, and again, not a lot of this is like brand new, aha, like walking away with this shiny thing. All of you probably have innately had these experiences, these thoughts, these feelings, but now my only hope is that you have the words to share it with others, and naming and helping others name their experiences to create that mutual understanding and just compassion. And Jen, I think you really, highlighted that in your example as well. Anybody else? And at this point too, I would open it like, what other questions do you guys have about moral injury as a whole, or curiosities in terms of how this could be utilized within the context of your work? Because we have about 13 minutes left. Yes, Sandy.
I think with my personal experience this past weekend, I come from a similar experience. I was raised in the foster care system. And then recently, when my birth mother passed away, went to go close some doors, right? But walking into those previous chapters of life, not knowing maybe where I was with those things, but also seeing where brothers and sisters were that I haven't seen in 20 years, but I knew what I was doing personally, So understanding where the dynamics of other individuals and their reactions, why they're reacting in anger, why they're reacting in sadness, or just in general, especially coming with, from the IDD population and coming from different types of placements. And like you said, the ambiguous loss, it's happening all over the place with care workers, social workers, not just on the macro level. I probably am saying that wrong, but there's that macro level, all those different types of things are affected for that, just that one individual, but the community that supported that one individual, you know. And so I think sometimes we lose track of being transparent, and like you said, holding our truths, but also making sure that we're creating that safe environment for so many people to be able to um, share their own ambiguous trauma, so to speak, you know. So I learned a huge lesson that even though I had trauma, there's other people going in with the same trauma who aren't going to communicate how I learned how to communicate. So, you know, go with kindness always, you know.
Absolutely. And I think too, Sandy, what your experience has brought up to me was holding that level of vulnerability can be very taxing and very challenging all of the time, whether it's in personal relationships or within the context of our work, right? We interact with some very unique individuals who have their own challenges, and presenting that level of vulnerability and openness to hearing their experiences can be very draining. And ensuring, as it seems like a lot of you already have these great skills with self-care, but making sure that you're implementing those protective factors, and maybe even in some contexts acknowledging if and when moral injury does occur, and you still have perhaps legal or policy obligations to act in a specific way. Both can be true. Yes, I have to do this thing, I have to take this action, whether that's removing a child or moving a adult services individual. I don't necessarily agree with this, but in my job, in the context of me as a professional, I have the obligation to. And whether that's verbally saying it or mentally, there is a level of power that you get back by acknowledging it, and doing so in a way that honors yourself and honors whatever task you have to do at hand, because there will be conflicts. Making sure that both can be true. Anybody else have any comments, feedback, questions? Well, in that case, I do want to just thank you all for being here today. It has been a pleasure to be able to be with you. And in order to leave you, I think, with some uh, hopefully positive words, is um, acknowledging that grief and loss can be an integral part of not only a child welfare experience, but any type of system experience. And that failure to acknowledge this and meet children, families, and professionals with the compassion and level of connection needed can often create further opportunity for moral injury and divide. So attempts to intervene and address ambiguous loss and moral injury must look beyond the individual sufferers to changing larger social, economic, political contexts in which these injuries do occur. And this responsibility, again, it does not lie solely on us as affected individuals, such as parents and professionals, but require a larger cultural shift in these values to foster true belonging and connection. So I empower you all as you move forward from today to engage with others in the spirit of connection and fostering vulnerability and compassion around ambiguous loss, disenfranchised grief, and moral injury. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Chase. Wow. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I took two things. I can create that psychologically safe place for the people I work with, my employees, families, children. But then for self-care, I need to find that psychologically safe place to be able to
Absolutely.
process some of this stuff. So good stuff. Thank you for your time, for sharing your expertise, your wisdom, giving us words. Yeah, it was really good. Thank you, Chase.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate being here today.
Hey, thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathy.